proceeding through Lecture 3 on Hegel and his method in A Pluralistic Universe by William James, and proceeding without an overarching plan in advance imposed on the text, top down by my brilliant mind, which I don't actually have. I am going through the text and finding what I find and doing what I can to make sense of it, progressing, we hope, towards a clearer understanding of everything. Yes, much like William James' own view as opposed to Hegel's view. All right. The only thing that is certain is that whatever you may say of his procedure, someone will accuse you of misunderstanding it. He's talking about Hegel and acknowledging that people will think that you misunderstand Hegel, James. And he says, yeah, I don't even pretend to understand Hegel. What I'm doing is, I make no claim to understanding it. I treat it merely impressionistically. What I'm doing is I'm describing my impressions of Hegel's method. And my impressions of Hegel's method are that he starts with a very important empirical observation that the world goes through this dialectical process. Review the last video. I don't need to try to explain that right now. It will take too long. Let's see. And then he moves from this very seriously important, genuine, accurate empirical observation into this less prudent way of trying to impose his own concepts on everything to make an orderly arrangement of things in such a way that we end up abandoning the empirical insight that started off this whole process and trying to impose monistically, rationalistically from our minds a monistic order that makes everything orderly by making everything one thing, and thereby abandoning the insights from experience that started off this whole process. All right, so James continues. So treating it, I regret that he should have called it by the name of logic. Clinging as he did to the vision of a really living world and refusing to be content with a chopped-up intellectualist picture of it, it is a pity that he should have adopted the very word that intellectualism had already preempted. But he clung fast to the old rationalist contempt for the immediately given world of sense and all its squalid particulars, and never tolerated the notion that the form of philosophy might be empirical only. If I have the ability to explain all that, I'm not going to pause to. I don't have time. I don't want to make this video too long. But I really do want to, in this video, get to some of the next observations. Let's just say one quick observation on what we just read. Hegel could not tolerate the notion that the form of philosophy might be empirical only. James is arguing that there can be a respectable philosophy that is purely empirical, that draws purely from experience and lives only in experience, and lives. Empirical philosophy is a lived philosophy. Etc. Hegel pretended, therefore, to be using the a priori method, etc. But what he really worked by was his own empirical perceptions, which exceeded and overflowed his miserably insufficient logical categories in every instance of their use. It's beautiful sentences critiquing Hegel. Whether accurate or not, these sentences are lovely. I regret that he should have called it by the name of logic. He pretended to be using the a priori method, but what he really worked by was his own empirical perceptions, which exceeded and overflowed his miserably insufficient logical categories in every instance of their use. So James doesn't think much of Hegel's ideas he tried to impose on the world, which reminds us of what he said, I don't know, a couple videos back, maybe 8 pages back, 10 pages back, I don't know, where he says, hardly anyone, maybe just 2 videos back, the beginning, I think it was, yes, the first paragraph of Lecture 3. He says, no one agrees with Hegel's particular arguments. And here he observes, Hegel wasn't very good with his logical categories. When Hegel applies a particular idea to a particular step in the dialectical movement of the universe, he tends to do a lousy job. And James is observing, well, I think that might be because experience was where he started, but he didn't stick with it. And he tried to impose these measly little logical categories from his own head on experience, but experience overflowed those, shall we say it overflowed those boxes. It overflowed his miserably insufficient logical categories. Hegel tried to put everything in little boxes he came up with, and the world as we experience it will fill those boxes and flow on out of them. Nothing will work that way. Better to stick with the world of experience, James thinks. skipping a bit. Let's see. Maybe we shouldn't skip it. Let's see. He will quote from Hegel. And let me just pause this for a moment. All right, James will quote from Hegel, and I will read part of the quote. We must never view identity as abstract identity to the exclusion of all difference. That is the touchstone for distinguishing all bad philosophy from what alone deserves the name of philosophy. So let's say I say this is my teacup, and I give a definition of a teacup. Hegel is going to say, your definition, Mark, of a teacup must not be handled too abstractly. You must not say, your mind has the full definition of the teacup in and of itself, because in fact the teacup exists in relation to all these other things. Everything is connected, and the teacup cannot even be understood except in distinction with and sometimes conflict with all the other things it's connected to. There's no understanding of the teacup without understanding of me and of the tea kettle off to my left and of this book and of this freaking tie. Everything in the universe has some connection or some difference with this teacup. And you can't define the teacup abstractly all by itself, says Hegel in James' quote from Hegel, as I understand it. The distinction, now James is speaking for himself, the distinction that Hegel has in mind here is naturally, in the first instance, distinction from all other things or concepts. You know what? Let's not go there. Let's go back to the Hegel quote, resuming the Hegel quote. If thinking were no more than registering abstract identities, it would be a most superfluous performance. Things and concepts are identical with themselves, only insofar as at the same time they involve distinction. Okay, closing the Hegel quote. So let me see if I can paraphrase some of this. Things and concepts are identical with themselves only insofar as at the same time they involve distinction. Nothing has its own self-contained identity. The identity of anything is connected to its difference from everything else. There's no identity without difference from everything else, which is to say, every identity is connected to non-identity. The teacup does not have its own identity, except in distinction to everything else that's not the teacup. And that means its own identity is partially built up in its non-identity with other things. Identity involves non-identity. Now, James says the distinction that Hegel has in mind here is naturally, in the first instance, distinction from all other things or concepts. But in his hands, this quickly develops into contradiction out of them, and finally reflected back upon itself into self-contradiction, and the immanent self-contradictoriness of all finite concepts thenceforth becomes the propulsive logical force that moves the world. Okay, so James says, it would have been actually pretty reasonable if Hegel had just said, the identity of the teacup is distinct from other things. You can't understand the teacup properly without understanding the things it's separate from, distinct from. But then Hegel builds on this fairly simple and sensible insight, this idea that the identity of any object involves some self-contradiction because its identity requires it to be distinct from other things. The teacup's identity requires it to be distinct from the book, and therefore its identity involves non-identity, and therefore its identity is some kind of self-contradiction, and therefore we have an immanent self-contradictoriness of all finite concepts, which is the propulsive logical force that moves the world. That's the logical problem that forces us towards development, towards the ultimate synthesis. It's what makes dialectic happen. This is me trying to explain Hegel as James understands it. So, take this with 2 or 3 grains of salt. Once catch well the knack of this scheme of thought, and you are lucky if you ever get away from it. It is all you can see. Let anyone pronounce anything, and your feeling of a contradiction being implied becomes a habit. If you think too much like Hegel, well, if once you understand the knack of this scheme of thought, note that James calls it a knack. It's not so much really good logic, it's a knack. It's a knack for thinking of things as involving their own self-contradiction. The Hegelian has difficulty thinking of even a simple teacup without thinking that teacup's necessarily contradicting itself. There's a self-contradictory conflict built into the very identity of the teacup. Once you catch the knack for thinking of things in this way, it's difficult to stop thinking that way. It's all you can see. It becomes almost a motor habit in some persons who symbolize by a stereotyped gesture the position, sublation, and final reinstatement involved. etc., etc. Whatever you posit appears thus as one-sided and negates its other, which being equally one-sided negates it. And since the situation remains unstable, the two contradictory terms have together, according to Hegel, to engender a higher truth of which they both appear as indispensable members, mutually mediating aspects of that higher concept of situation and thought. Now keep in mind, James says, I'm giving you my impressions of Hegel. I'm not claiming to understand it, and I also am not claiming to understand Hegel. I hope I'm understanding James. That's as high as I can aim. Let's see if I can put some of this into my own paraphrase, though. I don't want to keep holding the book. Let's hold the pen and the teacup. So in the Hegelian idea, we take the very real, very empirical, very sensible observation that the pen is not the teacup, and that you can't really define the pen without implying some difference between the pen and other things that are not pens, like teacups. You can't define the teacup without implying, well, you can't give a complete understanding of the teacup without understanding its distinctness from other things like pens. And Hegel takes this idea and goes crazy with it. Hegel takes this idea and says, therefore, the very identity of the teacup is built therefore, built into the very identity of the teacup is its distinction from the pen, its non-identity with the pen. You can't understand the teacup without understanding how it's not the pen. The teacup can't exist without having built into it its not being the pen, and therefore non-identity is built into identity, and therefore there's always this self-contradiction of anything with itself, and that's because of its distinctness from any other thing, which also is self-contradictory with itself. And this whole muddled conflict of conflicting things in the world is what makes dialectic necessary. It's why we have to have that synthesis that takes the pen and the teacup and then harmonizes them into one whole somehow. But Hegel will give his metaphysical theories as to how. Okay. Let's see. Rationalism, you remember, is what I called the way of thinking that methodically subordinates parts to wholes. So Hegel here is rationalistic through and through. If you go back and watch earlier videos from lecture 1, I think it was, Hegel will not understand things according to their parts like the empiricist does. Hegel will say, well, you can't understand the pen or the teacup by themselves and build an understanding on that. No, you can only understand the pen or the teacup by finding some combined reality that unites them. That's a rationalistic, not an empirical way of thinking. Empirical instances of the way in which higher unities reconcile contradictions are innumerable. So here again, Hegel's vision, taken merely impressionistically, not claiming to understand Hegel, agrees with countless facts. Somehow, life does, out of its total resources, find ways of satisfying opposites at once, etc. Oh no, let's keep going. This is precisely the paradoxical aspect which much of our civilization presents. Peace we secure by armaments, liberty by laws and constitutions, simplicity and naturalness are the consummate result of artificial breeding and training. Health, strength, and wealth are increased only by lavish use, expense, and wear. So there is some genuine empirical insight that sometimes sometimes some higher thing harmonizes lower things that were in some form of tension. That's a real thing that happens. Merely as a reporter, skipping a couple paragraphs, merely as a reporter of certain empirical aspects of the actual, skipping actually only 1.5 paragraphs. Merely as a reporter of certain empirical aspects of the actual, Hegel then is great and true, but he aimed at being something far greater than an empirical reporter, so I must say something about that essential aspect of his thought. Hegel has some brilliant empirical observations, but he aimed to do more than empirical observations. He aimed to have this vision of, well, I don't know how to say this. I could almost say the godlike emergence, or the emergence of a godlike thing that fixes everything, resolves all the contradictions. And also there's this. Advance in thinking in the Hegelian universe has, in short, to proceed by the apodictic words must be rather than by those inferior hypothetic words may be, which are all that empiricists can use. So Hegel will not allow possibility. Hegel insists on necessity. Hegel says if you're going to advance in our understanding of things, if you're going to achieve a higher order, if you're going to come up with any way of explaining how the pen and the teacup can even exist without their self-contradictory, without the conflict between the two self-contradictory things, if you're going to come up with any theory or any way of thinking about the world that explains all this and puts all the pieces together, it must be a certain way. There can be no resolution of conflict except that which is by necessity, says Hegel. And James is like, well, no, I think chance and possibility are real things. I think it's reasonable to say that some resolution, some conflicts can happen not by inevitability, but as a realization of what was a mere possibility, as an alternative to other possibilities. And of course, this also goes back to his views on free will, going back to earlier writings, The Will to Believe and Other Essays in Popular Philosophy, where James thinks, and actually this was in his initial definition of radical empiricism at the beginning of that book, where James thinks, I believe in free will, and I believe that there is a human ability to choose among different possibilities that will affect the final state of things. So James is very interested in an almost Hegelian resolution of all the conflicts. He wants everything put together in an orderly fashion, eventually, if at all possible, much like Hegel. But he says we can do it empirically. We can do it by possibility, not necessity, and going from the particular things upward, not imposing top-down some order I came up with in my head. And the human choice among different ways of trying to bring order to things is going to make some difference to the final order that results. Now, I'm quite sure, the sort of thing James thinks. I can't promise you will find a passage in the text later that says that. Anyway, this video has gone on long enough. I have to run to class. Thanks for watching.